Howdy. If you're joining me this afternoon, my name is Stephen Bruggerhoff, horticulturist with Brazoria County AgriLife Extension, the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension horticulturists. Starting in just a moment or two to allow some folks to get online and check out this wonderful presentation. The presentation will be on native plants of Texas. We'll look a little bit about how you can garden more effectively with them. We'll cover some plants that are more popular in the nursery industry and the landscape industry, as well as maybe more familiar with the homeowner. And then we'll also cover some plants that are a little rare, not quite so common, that are in this particular garden that I'm at. So if you'll allow me just a moment, I'll get my bearings and kind of ditch out of the scene just for a second, and I'll be right back. Psst, what time is it?
12:58.
I'm starting. All right, folks. Welcome to the Aggie Horticulture program. Facebook Live, we've been broadcasting these programs for the past couple of months, twice a week, bringing best practices and different aspects of horticulture to the homeowner, to the practitioner, to the producer. We have these programs to help improve your life and help improve some of your horticultural skills. Some skills you may already own and some you may want to learn about. We've got some great horticulturists that are here to provide some answers to your questions. I'm Stephen Bruggerhoff, Brazoria County AgriLife Extension horticulture agent in Angleton. But where I'm broadcasting from is Pearland, Texas. So if you're from around the area, you know where Pearland is. If you're not, say you're joining us from North Texas, possibly, it's possible, West Texas or even Louisiana, we're just a little southeast of Houston proper, the great state of Houston. Angleton is the county seat. That's where I'm located. That's a little bit between here and the coast, about 30 miles southeast from here in the coast. But it's a pleasure to serve you and bring this program to you. I'll let you know that I am flying solo on this program, so I won't be answering any questions for you, but we do have very experienced colleagues that will be providing answers to you. So please, if you're joining us just now, should be about 1 o'clock at this point. I'm Stephen Bruggerhoff, horticulturist with AgriLife Extension, stationed in Brazoria, for Brazoria County in Angleton, Texas. Little bit about native plants, but before I do that, again, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and submit them to the chat box function of Facebook. Our experienced and colleagues will be able to answer questions and help you discover some resources that may be applicable to the questions that you do have. Again, I'll be talking about native plants of Texas. Of course, I'll be focusing on some plants that are more appropriate for our ecoregion, for the Gulf Coast Prairie. But there are some plants that I'll be talking about that have a wider distribution, native plants that have a wider distribution as well. I will also include some plants that are what we call adapted, so non-natives but are appropriate for use in the landscape. I'm broadcasting. I'd like to give a shout out to, I would call them local sponsors. I'm broadcasting from the Pearland Community Garden here in Pearland, Texas, a little southeast of Houston. Pearland Community Garden is supported by the city of Pearland and a great organization, community resource organization called Keep Pearland Beautiful. We've had a great collaboration with Keep Pearland Beautiful locally, providing presentations on a monthly basis for our folks. I'm also a member of the Pearland Community Garden, so I really enjoy practicing what I preach, being out here managing a vegetable plot that my wife and I have, where we're growing plants for our own home use, and we also help to donate to local charities. But I really want to focus on some of the native plants that are out here. We do have a community member, a garden member. I won't tell you her last name, or even her first name, but anyway, she's a member of the local chapter of the Native Plant Society of Texas. Martha, if you're watching, even if you're not watching or watch this later, shout out to Martha. Martha has been responsible for including some really unique specimens out here at this garden, some native plants. And we'll focus on some of those plants as well. So again, shout out to the sponsors of this particular episode, Keep Pearland Beautiful, and the city of Pearland as well. And of course, Brazoria County AgriLife Extension and our great team of extension specialists and horticulturists with Aggie Horticulture. Aggie Horticulture has been bringing these programs to you to give you best practices, give you the best tools that you can use to improve your techniques and home gardening practices. So I'm standing in front of a native plant as well. Here we're in an area of Texas called the Upper Gulf Coast Bend. And it's the ecoregion itself is comprised mostly, I would call it mostly Gulf Coast prairie. A lot of the plants that you might see naturally distributed in natural areas are more along the lines of prairie plants. There are some woody species, but when I talk about prairie plants, usually I'm talking about annual plants, those that come up 1 year, flower, produce seed, and then they're done. They're dead for the year. The seed that itself hopefully is distributed enough to be able to produce next year's crop. So we consider those to be annuals. And then some perennials, which will be a combination of a few trees, maybe a vine, some shrubby type plants, perennials that are more herbaceous or more vegetative. We'll be focusing on those as well. But this one behind me, I really don't see it out in natural areas here along the Gulf Coast. This is a native persimmon tree that's right behind me. These native persimmon trees do occur in a little bit north of Huntsville, Texas, or what we call, in the around the Pine Curtain, I would say, as you're heading up the northeast part of Texas. This tree can get really huge, really tall. Right now it's standing, you can't really see it, and I'm 6'4", but this tree is probably reaching to about 30 feet right now, and it has the potential to go even higher. It will produce fruit. We haven't seen fruit on it just yet. We're hoping that it will. So, native plant right behind me. Shout out to the native trees that we have in Texas. I'm going to ask y'all, you the viewer, how you define a native plant. If you have a moment, go ahead and include that in the chat function of the Facebook account that you're watching right now. Give us your definition of what you think a native plant is. I'll maintain a moment of silence only for a second, and then I'll proceed with my presentation. In the meantime, look at this beautiful persimmon tree. So, I believe that even amongst the professionals, there's not really one defined or one definition of what a native plant is. I've heard many, many different reasons or many different descriptions of what a native plant is. Just a little bit of my background. I went to school at the University of Washington in Seattle and participated in an urban conservation program, urban horticulture program there. That's where I got a lot of my learning from. My academic program was there in Seattle, Washington. So I got to see a little bit outside of Texas. I got to see flora and vegetation and fauna in another state. It was an amazing experience. But my home is here in Texas, and you've heard Texans have a lot of pride in place and especially in the plants that we have. So a little story: when I was in Seattle, Washington, and my master gardeners who may be watching this have heard me talk about this before, say this before. I went to Seattle, Washington. I saw some colleagues, some students there that maybe were from the area or were from the northeast part of the United States. And I would proudly tell them I'm from Texas, and I'd get this little wrinkle of their nose. They'd say, "Ooh, you're from Texas," and I had to question why I got that reaction. Why were they a little, not put off, but a little hesitant to engage with me? And I said, "Well, what is your impression of Texas?" And I would ask them, "Okay, if you can think of a plant, what would be a primary plant that you would think of in Texas?" And some of you might be thinking the same thing. If you're an outsider, you've been told that Texas is this big state, that is mostly dry, that it has cowboys in it. As far as the first thing that comes to your mind is what would you think of as a plant in Texas? What would that be? Well, the folks that I would talk to would tell me, oh, you have cactus, it's all cactus there. And I tell folks, no, it's a huge palette. It's a broad state. It's so big. We have 10 what we consider to be vegetative zone or vegetation zones here in Texas. We have plants that are endemic, which means they are genetically or naturally distributed in a certain ecoregion within Texas, right? So there is a columbine that's thought to be endemic to the hill country, that in its natural distribution it doesn't occur anywhere else but in smaller populations within a certain area in the hill country. There's a plant that I'll show you here at the garden that's a hibiscus that is endemic and resides or is naturally distributed in areas around the Angelina Forest, I believe, here in Texas. So they would think it was a cactus, and I said, no, we've got 10 vegetative zones. We have the Gulf Coast prairies, we have our East Coast, right? South Texas has its own vegetative zone in flora that's specific to that area. Remnant blackland prairie. It's called the blackland prairie. It's more of a remnant blackland prairie, but that still exists. Part of a prairie ecosystem that occurred from around central Texas all the way up through the Great Plains and towards Canada. Okay? It would just make sense that there would be plants that only existed in that region, but also plants that could exist through that region as well. So I hope that helps you to understand a little bit into the mindset of someone that you're talking to outside of our state. So again, getting back to my story, they thought it was cactus, and I'm like, no, we have a lot broader palette that we can work with. And I'll show you some of those plants that you can work with at your home that are easily accessible from nurseries. Some that are a little bit more exotic, but trust me, I think you'll enjoy taking a glimpse at the beauty, the full breadth and beauty of what Texas has to offer. So when they say, are Texans proud? Heck yes, we are proud. And of course, we have such a large piece of real estate to work with as well. The beauty of working with native plants, you may have heard this before. Native plants, working with native plants, you can use less resources when you do incorporate native plants into your landscaping palette. Now again, I'm not a purist. I did work for the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, a native plant botanical garden in Austin, Texas. It was a great association. I had a great learning experience while I was there for the full 8 years that I was working there. So I have a great understanding of the native plants that we have here in Texas, a broader palette of plants that occur naturally in our state. But I'm also not a purist. I do believe that we should incorporate plants that are appropriate, or what we call adapted plants. We'll view one or two of those while we're in this garden as well. So we'll get back to this point. What is your definition of a native plant? When we start talking about these broader concepts, when you understand that Texas is a huge state, Texas is a large state. It's not huge, it's just large, right? Large state. There's quite a bit of variation in regions of Texas and vegetation and how that displays itself. It helps you to understand that we have a lot of diversity in this state, and of course, as Texans, we do celebrate diversity. So, I am going to grab the camera, take it with me. It may jostle for a minute. A lot of what I'd like to do is have the plants explain themselves. While I show them to you, I'll be talking behind the camera as well. Plus, I'll be able to keep an eye on what I'm looking at from the camera's point of view to be able to give this presentation to you a little bit better. So, native plants are, this is just my version of how I define a native plant. A native plant is a plant that has a natural distribution in place. It may have an ecological time or a geological time associated with it. Is a yaupon. Has that been existing in place for over 500 or 1,000 years, or has it been here and naturalized for a little bit less time and then been distributed? So there are broad definitions for native plants. Each one of us has our own definition for what that is. USDA has botanists, the United States Department of Agriculture, they do have botanists, and they do have programs where they do talk about our local ecology, about conservation programs that we do have. By the way, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, or Texas A&M Systems, University Systems, does have an environmental conservation program and research specific to us. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll provide resources to you after the program. We'll have those available to you. So before we take off in the gardens, I'll allow you a moment to ask any questions that you like. We do have horticulture experts on tab to be able to answer those questions as they come in. If we can't answer them immediately, we'll make certain to get to them and get to you after the program. All right, folks, let's go on a little field trip, shall we? I'm going to take you on a tour of the gardens. For the moment, you can look at this wonderful Texas, this persimmon, this eastern persimmon. All right. Pay no attention to that tree or those people. All right, folks. I'm tangled up in my microphone, so here we go. The Pearland Community Garden was set up as a resource for the community. We do have donation beds and wonderful program that we also donate produce to. But we also have an enthusiast, Martha, who's been developing these beds out here. Now remember, just because it's a native plant doesn't mean it will always work in place. The best advice that I can give to you, go to those organizations or those resources that have lists of native plants that are appropriate for your area. They either grow here naturally or can be added to your palette of landscaping here. What we're looking at are some typical native plants that you will see roadside, as well as some that you may have planted yourself. Of course, here's the very popular and iconic, we call it Firewheel. The botanical name on this is Gaillardia pulchella. I think pulchella means a cute little one in Italian. Don't quote me on that. You can look that up yourself. But it's an iconic annual plant that we'll see blooming around this time of year. It's just now going into seed, but it's a great resource for some pollinators that do recognize those floral patterns on the petals. They'll look at the different colors in a different spectrum that we do, and they're attracted to that plant for those vibrant colors. So again, usually it's black and white that they'll see in, or a different range of frequencies than we do. There's also other plants that you may have seen that you can purchase at nurseries. For instance, I believe this is a Coreopsis. Sometimes it's called tick seed. I'll have to verify that with Martha. But one plant that I want to point to you, and we'll see it again in just a moment. If y'all can, there's a clumping plant right here with these tongue-shaped leaves, right? It's kind of a clumping plant. Puts up a really long, slender flower stalk. Right now, it's out of flower, but we will see some that are in flower. There are 3 different species of what we call coneflower. Rudbeckia is the genera on this plant. And one of them that I'm more familiar with is called giant coneflower, but this is a special one that I've not seen before. It's called Texas coneflower, Rudbeckia texana. We even have plants named after our great state. So this bed really is an introduction to the gardens themselves. There's so much beauty in the differences in color and texture in the way that Martha has developed this bed, and I just think it's outstanding. Another plant that I want to point you to is 2 plants. One I said I'd show you an endemic plant, and we do have one here. It's called the Nueces, I believe it's Nueces, or Neches River Mallow. It's this hibiscus. Now you can see my hand, well, I've got a longer hand than most folks. And you can see the size of this particular flower. Note the reproductive organs inside that give it that characteristic look of a hibiscus. But this plant is endemic up around northeast Texas. In other words, it naturally occurs up in northeast Texas. Another plant I want to show you, and it has this wonderful texture and beautiful color. It's called Hooker's Oringo. For those of you who may have been in the floral design classes, You may have used a plant that we call sea holly. That's another common name for a broad number of species of Oringo. This is one, it's an annual plant called Hooker's Oringo, which is Erinium hookeri. It has this wonderful kind of lilac color to these bracts on the flower itself, on the inflorescence. It's kind of hard to see and may wash out in our view in the full sun, but I just think it's an outstanding plant. Now, notice where I'm at. Martha has developed a series of plants that can exist in as a riparian plant. In other words, they're planted creekside. There's a tiny little depression or ditch up and down this landscape. So what that means is that we do have periods where this area, this little ditch, gets wet and remains wet, and these plants can exist through this fabulously. Most of these are upland, in other words, they're high above where they're not getting their feet wet. The Erinium, certainly, the Oringo or Hooker's Oringo can remain wet. So we have two special plants that I've not seen that often. One endemic, the Neches River mallow. That's Hibiscus desiccalyx, I believe. And the other one is Erinium hookeri. Erinium hookeri is an annual. The hibiscus is a perennial plant. Now here's one that's iconic. Typically, we call it Texas star hibiscus, but guess what? This particular plant is not originally, does not have a natural distribution here in Texas. But we've adopted it and given it a name. That's how proud Texans are. So if you look at information from the United States Department of Agriculture, have botanists that have developed distribution maps of native plants. This plant doesn't exist, inside the borders of Texas with a natural distribution. Now, there is a methodology that they use, that the United States Department of Agriculture does use, to document how these plants are distributed. And they may have missed the boat on this one, but from what I know, this beautiful plant, which is easy to get by seed and is a perennial, originally doesn't have a natural distribution. It's been more naturalized here in our area. Really fascinating information. So again, when we're talking about native plants, just because it's a native doesn't mean it's always going to work in any area that you're landscaping in. So folks, I'm going to take you on a tour, more of a tour of the garden. I do have some master gardeners. We're keeping appropriate social distancing, but I'll be asking them for the time. You can go ahead and tell me.
1:20.
Excellent. I'm doing great on time. Folks, these programs typically are about 30 minutes. So I'll try to remain on time. We may go a little bit over, and thank you very much for your patience. So you can see this is all production beds, vegetable production out here at Pearland Community Garden. Again, shout out to our community garden members, the city of Pearland, and keep Pearland beautiful. This is another bed that I've been helping to manage and putting together. Excuse me for the falling down fencing on there. I need to get some money for it. So we have some plants. It's a mix of natives and appropriate adapted plants. One here is more iconic. You'll see this. You'll actually be able to get a seed for this quite readily. Sometimes I believe the common name is on this is tropical sage. Produces this wonderful, brilliant red color that's attractive to certain pollinators. We've all heard the sing-song statement about hummingbirds. Red colors attract hummingbirds, and certainly they do. Remember, hummingbirds are migratory. Some will set up shop in place. Some will just continue to migrate to other areas of the United States. So when we're working with native plants, of course, they do take very little less resources. I do provide water to this, but I'm trying to implement water conservation by watering this plant only when we get into the heat of summer. We've just been relying on this bed for natural rain events, and it's been working like a champ. There's some plants that have already taken off, like the Firewheel that we saw earlier. This salvia that you see, it's actually a Texas superstar. So shout out to our partners with the Texas Nursery Landscape Association, Texas Department of Agriculture, and Aggie Horticulture. This is a specific Texas superstar called Mystic Spires Blue. It's just a beautiful, outstanding color of this particular hybrid. It is a hybrid with with a native mealy blue sage and another salvia called Salvia longa spicata, but it's been working like a champ. It has great texture, wonderful height. It doesn't get more than about 2 feet tall with as a shrub. It produces those wonderful flower colors that hold their own. Another Texas superstar that we have, I can't remember the common name or the name that's used for it in the industry. It's this tall, I believe it's a Miscanthus. It's called Napier grass, but it's another Texas superstar. This one is as tall as I am. It's a clumping grass that is appropriate for our area. I have had to cut it back, but it's easy to maintain, and it provides this wonderful purple color to the grass. It makes a great backdrop, a background for this this arrangement of plants that I've made. And right in front of it is a native shrub called Barbados Cherry. It is just now starting to produce some flowers, and in time it will produce fruit that are necessary for some of those animals that do cruise through here. And the last superstar I'll cover is on the back side of this garden. This is a variety of Turk's cap. It's called Pams Pink, or I can't remember the other name, but the difference between this plant and the native or the species that you'll find naturally distributed, the Turk's cap we're familiar with has bright red flowers. This one has delicate pink flowers, and it was named in honor of Pam Prairie. All right, folks, let's walk over to the icing on the cake. If y'all could let me know when it gets to be 3:35. Excellent. Now, this is the icing on the cake. A little bit a stroll through our production beds here at the gardens. I'm really impressed with the collection that Martha has put together. Another reason why we have these native plants out here. There are some native plants. There are native plants that are host to insects that occur naturally in our area. So where we might have incorporate a plant like a hydrangea in our landscape design, it may not provide an adequate resource as a nectar resource or a host plant for a lot of insects that we'll have here. Now, y'all may recognize, now this is the Standout Garden that Martha has developed, and I really like it because it's exclusively native plants. So it gives you a good idea of the kind of plants and breadth of plants that we can grow here in the Gulf Coast. And again, some of these you'll be able to grow in your area as well. Everything from this tree-form Yopon. You may be surprised by the species name. This is called Ilex. All plants will have two scientific names or taxonomic names to them. This one is called Ilex, which is the first name, genera. The last name is the species name is Vomitoria. That's correct, you heard the word right, Vomitoria. Interesting plant. It has its own fact and fiction associated with this native shrub, but I really dig it, I really like it. This one probably is a male plant. What I mean by that is it produces only male flowers. There's another one, members of the holly family will produce either all male flowers on one plant or all female flowers on another plant. I can't remember if this one produces berries. If it does, if it produces red berries, it will be a female. In essence, it's a female. Another plant that I'm glad Martha brought into the gardens is this one. Sometimes it's it's a prairie plant called Blazing Star. It's also given the name Gayfeather. There's several different species of Gayfeather across the breadth of Texas. Remember, Texas is a very big state, and so there's quite a diversity here in Texas vegetatively. This one is Liatris. Liatris is the genera or the first name. Pycnostackia is the species name. It's tall. It's about 5 feet tall right now. Typically in the prairie, you wouldn't see a plant get this tall, but we're providing it more than adequate resources. It's existing in enriched soil. It's getting watered on a regular basis. So this plant is really shining its best. It's not in flower yet. It will be in flower in another month. but it's really setting up right now, and I just wanted to show that one to you. You may recognize some of these other annual plants. This one's called Brown-Eyed Susan. It's a coneflower. Rudbeckia is the first name, the genera on it. But of course, these plants are here to provide a resource, whether it's seed later on for some of those animals that may need that resource, or actively pumping out a lot of nectar. It's just glorious. Here's one I did not mention to our horticulturists. This one's called Ironweed. I believe it's called Ironweed, yes. Vernonia is the genera, but I can't remember the species name, but it's tall, it's just now starting to flower. So there is a succession of some of these plants, and when they flower, when they come into flower, when they show their best, and then when they start to produce seed and go out. As perennials, they may produce flowers and go into a sort of dormancy after they're producing their seed. This is a different Arenium. This is a different sea holly. You remember the first one that we looked at. That one is Hooker's Oringo. This one is called Rattlesnake Master. Now, Rattlesnake Master is known as a perennial. Remember, the other Oringo is known as an annual plant. Rattlesnake Master is a prairie plant that sometimes we'll see in natural areas. It produces these wonderful, prickly floral structures. It doesn't have a bluish cast to it like Hooker's Oringo does, and it does raise up about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. Plants like this, once you get to know them and get introduced to them, maybe you can find some plants that are appropriate for your area that will grow well. The hibiscus that I showed you earlier, it probably wouldn't do as well here in this upland here where it's a little bit dry, where the soil's a little bit hard. It probably wouldn't do as well unless we had its feet a little bit wet. The one thing I really like about, one of the many things that I really like about this particular garden, and some of the gardens that we've seen, is the use of these in their design elements. So we can learn about native plants all we want to, but it's great to get to know what their stature is, what their flowering color is, the benefits that they can provide to wildlife. Martha has gone the extra mile and had this particular garden designated by Texas Parks and Wildlife, or in collaboration with Monarch Watch, as a Monarch Way Station. I think that's just outstanding. So we're here at the garden, we're not only about growing vegetables for our community and for ourselves, but also providing education, a component of education to those folks that may want to visit our garden, as well as to the members themselves. The last tree that I'll leave you with, because I believe I'm running out of time, and thank you again for joining me today. This is a plant, a native plant that can exist in a wetter area and a little bit more dappled shade or full sunlight, obviously. It's right next to the Yopon, but this is a dogwood. It's called, the common name for it is Florida dogwood. It's kind of hard to distinguish it in this camera view, so I'm trying to give you a good view of what this might look like. But I love, the one thing I do love about dogwoods, this one doesn't have that big flower that you'll see in the dogwoods in East Texas, but one thing I do like about these trees is they'll have these reddish stems. It provides a little bit of contrast. So if you're thinking about adding a tree to your landscape, think about some of the colors along the stems, the bark as well. You can see that it has already gone to flower. They have very insignificant flowers, and the fruit, remaining fruit, is what we call doll's eyes, right? They may turn white. Now the challenge with a plant like dogwood, be careful with it. It does sucker readily in the landscape, and you can maintain that by mowing over those suckers that come up in the landscape, but it has been used in erosion control. You will see it grow in its natural environment, growing in larger populations. So just be aware of that once you get to know that information. So folks, I'm going to leave you now and try to turn the camera around. Let's see if I can do this. I want to thank you all for joining me today. My name is Stephen Brugerhoff. I'm horticulturist with Aggie Horticulture with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I'm based out of Brazoria County in Angleton, Texas. Thanks so much to my Aggie Horticulture colleagues that have been able to provide you answers for some questions that you have. We'll continue on these programs. We have another program this coming Friday at 1 o'clock. I really appreciate your time being with you. If you have any questions, of course, if you're in the area, please contact me at my office. Just check us out on our website, brazoria.agrilife.org. Thank you for joining me on this tour of through native plants. There's so much more that you could learn. One last thing I'd like to leave you with. Go ahead, investigate and explore some of those resources that are available through Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and the Texas A&M systems. We do have some information related to home gardening and conservation that you can apply to your own home landscape. There'll be a list of resources from a different website. Also, investigate some of those online resources. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is one that I go to. They have updated contemporary information on native plants as well. Aggie Horticulture does provide some resource to woody trees and shrubs. It was created on behalf of Benny Simpson, I believe. That's an older website, but it's very valuable information. As far as resources for some of these plants, some are easier to obtain at nurseries. Always contact your nurseries. Tell them, ask them about certain native plants that you'd like to see them carry. They'd love to help you out because they're there for you as well. And always explore your local resource as well. Get in touch with your ag agent or your horticulture agent in your county. Ask them how to get a list of native plants for your ecoregion. Texas Parks and Wildlife has offices around as well. You can get in touch with those folks. Master naturalists, of course. We partner with Texas Parks and Wildlife. Master gardeners, very important component of what we do here. So get in touch with our master gardeners as well. Shout out to the Master Gardener System. And the Native Plant Society of Texas. There are chapters throughout the state with enthusiasts and professionals that are there to help you celebrate the beauty and environment of Texas. Again, this is Stephen Brugerhoff from Brazoria County AgriLife Extension, broadcasting from the City of Pearland sponsored program, the Pearland Community Garden. Thank you very much for joining me today. Y'all have a splendid day. I'll see you later.